Good morning, all of you. This is Ashish sir. How are you doing today? Hey, hope you all are doing good and your studies are continuing excellent. Okay, so today let's start with macroeconomics. As you know, you have two books. One is the Indian Economic Development and second is Introductory Macroeconomics. So a lot of you had many doubts. You had requested me to start the lessons again since you were having difficulty. So I've decided that we would be starting from the first chapter itself so that you students have a lot of revision, okay, so that you are better able to understand the concepts. So let us start first with your introduction, your first chapter. Okay. So as you can see here, we'll be covering the concept, aggregates. What are macroeconomic aggregates? What are economic agents and the uses or significance, also applications of macroeconomics. Okay. So let us discuss this one by one. First, what is macroeconomics? Why do we study macroeconomics? So macroeconomics, when we talk about economics is studied under two main branches. One is macroeconomics and the other is microeconomics. Now, last year in class 11th, we had studied introductory microeconomics, right? So what is the basic difference between both of them? Microeconomics deals with individual identities such as a consumer, a school, a producer, a firm, or for that matter, an industry. Now, many of you are confused as to, sir, when we talk about an industry, there are various firms. So what is an industry? All firms producing similar kinds of products or giving similar kinds of services are together clubbed into an industry, right? However, there should be no confusion at all because an industry also indicates a single type of product or a single type of service. For example, let's take an example of the textile industry. So all the firms producing textiles will be clubbed together under a single industry, which is a textile industry. Okay, but that is an microeconomic identity. Industry, why? Because even though there are several firms, they all are producing similar types of products or services, so they will be defined or they will be under the purview of microeconomic studies. Okay. However, when we talk about those economic phenomena that affect the population at large, the whole country, the whole world, such as, for example, employment. Now, problems of unemployment, they affect across regions, across states, across countries. So that problem is a macroeconomic problem. Okay, a macroeconomic problem is, or in macroeconomics, we study those phenomena which affect the whole economy at large. For example, national income, GDP. Okay, if the GDP of a country is good, overall well-being of all the citizens will be good, right? Similarly, if the national income or the per capita income is really high, that means that the country has a very good pay scale or good infrastructure. The GDP is good, right? So that's why per capita income is good. So that affects everybody living in the country. So it's a macroeconomic phenomenon. Okay, good. So now that you are clear with the concepts, let's talk about what are aggregates, macroeconomic aggregates. Macroeconomic aggregates are basically divided into two main categories. One is aggregate supply, the other is aggregate demand. I had taught you this last year as well. However, let me explain that once again to you. Aggregate supply. Now, what is aggregate supply? Remember, aggregate. So it is the supply of goods and services that all the producers in a given economy are willing to supply within one accounting year. And what is aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is the demand of all the goods and services by the consumers in a given economy within one accounting year. Okay? So the expenditure that the consumers incur on buying the products or services in one accounting year, that is consumption expenditure. Whereas producers, they invest money. They make an investment. What is an investment? An investment is simply increasing the stock so that they can get more returns, more profit for the investment. So an investment is nothing but addition of stock to the already existing stocks. So when the producers per se invest in buying a new plant and machinery to increase the production, right? That is investment expenditure. So you have two expenditures here. One is consumption expenditure, the other is investment expenditure. Okay, moving ahead to economic agents. Now, what are economic agents? Economic agents are those that are involved in economic activities that are responsible for even helping the economy or keeping it under control. Now, you know that an economy can suffer from inflationary or deflationary phases. Now, what is inflation? Inflation is when all the necessary goods, which are your basic necessities of life, food articles, right? FMCG products, fast moving consumer goods, okay? Or your daily necessities, petrol for that matter, diesel. Now, when all these cooking gas, all these things, when their price increases to such levels, when it becomes difficult for the common man to purchase it easily, then we say it's a situation of inflation. This arises because of huge demand. So when the demand increases in proportion to the supply, there's an inflationary situation. Whereas, let's take an example of when the people are not earning enough or their earnings have been affected. They would not be ready to purchase that much as they used to, right? So that demand becomes less compared to the supply, just the other way around. So it is exactly the opposite of inflation. So it's deflation. In deflation, demand becomes less, supply is more. Okay? So who are these economic agents? Now, when we talk about microeconomic agents, they are the consumer and the producer. Those two, they affect the economic decisions. However, when we talk about macroeconomics, in that case, when you talk about macroeconomics, in that case, the economic agents are those that help in the economic decisions, such as SEBI, Securities and Exchange Board of India, right? Besides the regulation of shares, how the stock market is regulated, or the RBI for that matter. It is responsible for all the monetary decisions within the country. There are two kinds of policies that the government, or in any nation, there are two kinds of policies that govern the economic system mainly. One is your monetary policy, okay, which is managed by the central bank. In India, the central bank is the RBI, Reserve Bank of India. And the second is the fiscal or the budgetary policy, which is decided by the government, how much to invest as per the receipts and expenditure, capital receipts, capital expenditure, which we would be studying more in detail in the chapter budget and the economy. So now the government decides on the budget and it manages the economy, how much to spend, how much money it would allot to defense, to railways, to different social development programs. And RBI, how it will manage the credit. In case of inflation, in case of inflation, it has to increase the interest rate. Why? Because we need to reduce the purchasing power. So if we increase the interest rate on easy loans, make the loans difficult to obtain, let's say for example we increase the margin money as I told you, then what happens? Then people are less able to buy things, the demand decreases. And in case of a deflationary situation, what we'll do? We have to increase the money supply. So how do we do that? We give easy loans, right? Lower rate of interest. So the RBI would reduce the rate of interest. Now, which rate of interest will it reduce? The repo rate, okay? Usually you might have read in many papers, RBI slashes the repo rate. What is repo rate? Repo rate is the rate of interest at which the RBI lends money to the commercial banks, and commercial banks in turn lend the money to the consumers, us, the people, okay, the customers. Okay, so economic agents, you're clear. Now we talk about the uses, applications, or significance of macroeconomics. Uses, applications, or significance of macroeconomics. Why do we study macroeconomics? What is the use of studying macroeconomics? Now, macroeconomic studies helps us to find or to maintain the economy, to balance the economy in a lot of ways. You ask me how, sir? First of all, it helps to calculate the national income, which is very important. It is the sum total of all your GDP and the net factor income from abroad. So when you calculate, you are given the gross domestic product, which is of course the sum total or the price or the total amount. Okay, now what is GDP? Gross domestic product is the total price of all the goods and services sold in a country within one accounting year. Okay, remember, within one accounting year. So the price of all the goods and services produced in an economy within one accounting year is known as gross domestic product. Now what we do is, with that, when we reduce the net indirect tax, we get net domestic product, NDP. You add the net factor income from abroad to NDP, you get NNP, which is net national product. Okay. Now here I will be not getting into the nitty-gritties or the details of the net domestic product at factor price or net domestic product at market price. That will be going in the next chapters, and how to calculate it. Okay, so for now, national income is very important. So to calculate that, we need again the help of macroeconomics. Government budget and the economy, again we need the help of macroeconomics. Also, the government is able to decide the policies on unemployment. It is able to design packages, relief packages for people who are unemployed, the farmers who have suffered a loss. How is this possible? This is possible because of macroeconomic studies. So macroeconomic studies help the government to formulate policies. They help the government to design relief packages for the farmers or for the working class, the unemployed, okay, like social security. Okay, plus studying macroeconomics helps the government to allocate the different funds and resources in its budget. Macroeconomics also helps to understand the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply, and accordingly to reach an equilibrium. So there are a lot of uses which we'll be covering in further chapters. Now, some macroeconomic concepts. What are they? Intermediate and final goods. As you can see, intermediate and final goods. So usually when we talk about goods, First of all, we divide them into intermediate goods and final goods. Now remember this very well. Now these are your basics. For the purpose of calculation of national income, we only take the price, or we only add the price of final goods, never intermediate goods. Okay? Why so? Because the cost of intermediate goods are always included in the final goods. Let us take an example to try to understand this better. Now, let's take an example of bread. Okay. Now the flour is, let's say, priced at 20 rupees per kg. Okay. And the bakeries, they purchase the flour, they use butter, okay, they use yeast, okay, a lot of in their bakery products. When you talk about bread, they use flour, they use yeast, and if it's multigrain bread, they might be using grains like ragi, barley, and so on. Okay, so when they are using the flour and make it into bread, they are adding value to it. Why? Because the flour has to be further processed before we can consume it, before it can reach the consumers, or before it can be consumed by somebody, right? So when they add the raw materials, the flour, the yeast, the prices of these goods are included in the price of the bread. So they are intermediate goods. Flour is intermediate good, yeast is intermediate goods, or multigrains are intermediate goods here. Okay? Then, which is your final good? The packaged bread, the ready bread, which is ready to be used by the consumer. You simply go to a shop, you buy the bread and you utilize it, right? So then it's called a final good. When the good is outside the boundary of production, ready to be used by the consumer, and there's no further value being added to it, then it's a final good. But if a good has not crossed the boundary line of production, or there is still value to be added to it, it's an intermediate good. Take another example to understand this better. Let's talk about wooden planks. Right? There's a furniture shop that produces furnitures. Now when it purchases wooden planks or wood, now wood cannot be used for, unless it is not processed, it doesn't have much value, right? Apart from, of course, being used for firewood. Now nobody would use a board or a plank for firewood, right? So a board or a plank, which is actually a final good for the person who is selling it, okay, but for the consumer it isn't. So let us understand this in simple terms, that the wooden plank is a raw material that is to be utilized to make chairs or tables, right? So here for the furniture shop, it's an intermediate good, it's a raw material. Further, there might be paint or varnishes that might be applied to the final product before that furniture is ready to be sold to the consumer. So those paints and varnishes are also intermediate goods. Why? Because they are included in the cost of making that chair or table. So these are intermediate goods. And the final chair or the table, which is ready to be sold by the consumer, once it is sold to the consumer, then it becomes a final good. Okay. Now there are very, very important things to understand here, the difference between intermediate and final good. Now remember, 3 points which are very, very important for you to understand. When we are making the difference, or we are able to understand the difference between intermediate goods or final goods, so these 3 points help us understand which are intermediate goods or which are final goods. Now, number 1, any good that has not crossed the boundary line of production, which means still value has to be added to it, or is not sold to the final consumer. It hasn't crossed the boundary line of production means it hasn't been sold to the final consumer, yet value has to be added to it still. Okay, that is an intermediate good. So an intermediate good is the one that has not crossed the boundary line of production, value has to be added to it still, and third, a good which is purchased for resale. Now there are many goods that are purchased by a firm for reselling it, not for using it. Then it becomes an intermediate good. Electronic components, they are purchased by one firm and sold to the other, like motors, chips, transistors, diodes, right? These are purchased by persons. There are, let's say, for example, mobile cases, right? You guys are fond of mobile and, of course, using different lenses and cases. Okay, so there are many shops that buy these mobile accessories from one shop. Why? For reselling it, not for consuming. And it's an intermediate good for them, but for you it's a final good. So the end usage is very important in deciding a good, whether it is to be clubbed as an intermediate good or a final good. Let's take an example of a taxi operator. Let's say a car, okay? So if you and I purchase a car for using it for our personal purposes, for our home, it becomes a final good, okay? But if a taxi operator such as Uber or Ola purchases that car, so it is using that or purchasing that car to generate further income or to provide a service. In that case, it's an intermediate goods. Okay, it's an intermediate good. It is not a final good. Okay, so you need to remember these important points and you are good to go. You'll be easily able to understand or demarcate between an intermediate good or a final good. Then we talk about consumption goods and producer goods. Consumption and producer goods. Goods are further subdivided into consumer goods and producer goods. So what are consumer goods, or they are also known as consumption goods? Why? Because they are consumed by the common people or by us. They are consumed by the customers. For example, you purchase a bread, you purchase a packet of milk or a carton of milk from the market, butter, cheese, you consume it, right? So it's a consumer good. Usually, consumer goods are usually those goods, okay, which are utilized or used by the consumers, okay, not for producing further goods, but for satisfying their wants or needs. So that's a consumer good. However, there are some goods like plant and machinery. They are produced by production units, right, by different companies, but they are not directly used to satisfy our wants. They are used in producing further goods like plant and machinery. Or let's take a simple example of a printing press machine, right, of an offset printer. That printer is used for producing books, okay, for producing other materials, written materials, text, or a newspaper printing press. It is used to print newspapers. So now that is a capital good because it is used to produce further goods that have a utility value for us. Okay. But a newspaper is satisfying our want for knowledge, right? So that's a consumer good. Magazines are consumer goods. Okay. So I hope this is clear. We will further in next chapters, will further delve on the topic of consumer goods, the types of consumer goods. I'm trying to keep the video short because if it becomes very long, it'll be difficult for you to download as well. So we will be covering the different categories of consumer goods. Plus, we would be also trying to find out as to what are the three methods of calculation of national income, mainly the value added method, the expenditure method, or the income method. So that is for the further chapters. Hope today you have learned these concepts. Go through them, revise. You will be getting my notes and other assignments for the chapters as well. Okay. So until our next chapter, good day. See you tomorrow.